welcome to Inside the Admissions Office, the official podcast of InGenius Prep and your go-to resource for expert admissions strategy. My name is Noelle, and each episode, I'll bring you behind-the-scenes knowledge from former admissions officers about their first-hand experiences reviewing applications. Our strategies have helped countless students gain acceptance to top universities, and we're here to help your student gain that competitive edge and do the same. If you would like to set up a complimentary strategy call, simply follow the link in our episode description, and our expert team of enrollment counselors will work with you to create a personalized plan for admission into your student's dream school. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining me for another exciting episode. Now, before we start, I'd like to share that this will be my last episode as the podcast host. And to commemorate this, I have the absolute pleasure of interviewing Joel, who's not only the CEO and founder of InGenius Prep, but the ultimate college admissions expert to uncover all the hidden secrets in the admissions space. You definitely don't want to miss out on all the great advice he had to share, like this one.
My advice for students is if choosing an interest, try to choose something at the level of specificity of a college class, not at the level of specificity of a college major. So biology is a major. It's also super common. Marine biology is a class, usually not a major.
And this.
Most families that think they don't need help throughout high school have a very misguided view of what actually matters in the admissions process. For example, a couple of years ago, Yale was making a bit of a push to recruit more women in STEM fields. And so an admissions officer can help by saying, you're going Yale early action. We should really play up the STEM experiences.
All right, I hope you have your pens and papers ready. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. Hi, Joel. How are you today?
I'm great. Having a fun week nearing Friday. How about you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And I'm so excited to finally have you on our podcast. And I know we have a ton to chat through today, but before we start, can you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. So I'm Joel Butterly. I'm the co-founder and CEO of InGenius. I was born in the Boston area, but I grew up from age 12 to 18 in Vermont, so from a rural background. I went to Dartmouth College for undergrad. I had two majors and a minor while I was there. One was international relations, another was geographic information systems, and then the minor was in ethical philosophy. After Dartmouth, I went to Yale Law School, and I was actually a first year at Yale Law School when I started in InGenius. And the rest is history.
Perfect. So we've recently actually gotten quite a lot of new listeners. So I wanted to take this opportunity to almost reintroduce ourselves and share with our listeners the why behind InGenius Prep. So when we were first created in 2013, what gaps did you see in the college admission space that inspired you to create this almost one-stop shop for college admissions that we have today?
Yeah. So when we were starting out, there were a couple of observations that we had that led us to believe that there was a real need for a company like InGenius. So one of them was simple. It was the declining importance of standardized tests as a determinative metric for admissions, meaning essentially as standardized tests decline in importance, there's a commensurate rise in all of the other variables that a company like InGenius focuses on, including academic performance, extracurriculars, summer programs, applications, letters of recommendation, so on and so forth. And so our bet was that this sort of relationship between the kind of test prep industry and the admissions consulting industry, when the test prep industry at the time was maybe 1,000 times as large as the admissions consulting industry, that they would reach parity over time, meaning that there would be an increasing demand for our kinds of services, and there would be sort of a decrease in demand on the test prep side of things. And this is borne out very accurately in practice. In terms of looking at the kind of needs of the individual market, the market when we started out, and to some extent still today, was highly fragmented. It was essentially a cottage industry where individual companies were servicing a very small population of families, and none of the companies had enough scale to actually offer a unique set of resources. The best they could offer was individualized attention. And so when we were coming into this, what we were trying to figure out is, how do we work with a larger population of students, large enough so that we can really invest heavily in our educational resources, our curriculum, our extracurricular opportunities, et cetera, while still maintaining the level of consistency that you expect from a smaller company. And so there were three things that we did pursuant to these goals. So one was that we hired what is the world's largest team of former admissions officers. We have nearly 200 who work with us. And by my count, and it is only by my count, I don't know if this is official, but more than 50% of the admissions officers that I am aware of in this industry work with us. And the value of that is that every student gets to work individually with an admissions officer, as well as we get to take the collective knowledge of those admissions officers and bake it into our curriculum. So the second thing that we did is we developed a really vast curriculum that our counselors and students follow. And the purpose of the curriculum is to make sure that the students are always getting the best advice from counseling staff and to make sure that no detail is missed, right? There's a lot of individual dates that you have to keep in mind, just as one example. And so having a curriculum that forces accountability for counselors and students to those dates, like the date at which you have to submit an application, for example, is extremely important in ensuring quality as well as consistency of quality. The last thing that we did is we built a pool of resources that would allow us to not just offer students the best in class advice, but actually give them the opportunities to execute on that advice. So we developed what we call our academic mentorship program, which is a research program. We created what we call our leadership and innovation lab, which is a startup incubator to help students ideate, launch, and build their own companies, their own nonprofits. We have an internship program, we have soft skill programs, so on and so forth. So the idea here is that we're trying to offer you being students, the best in class advice from admissions officers, and then provide all of the resources necessary to actually follow through on that advice. So that's a very long answer to a relatively short question.
I love that. And it's clear that InGenius Prep was really founded from a baseline of care for students with the goal of really creating this foolproof system that gives students all the support they could possibly need. And in your response, you had mentioned a lot of our different programs and offerings. So I'd love to take a moment to dive deeper into each part of what we do. So let's start with Candidacy Building. From my end, I'm noticing that parents are having a harder time understanding Candidacy Building. Like I've seen parents say, my child is already team captain, is in a lot of extracurriculars, etc. We don't really need your help for that. So to that point, what would you say to these parents? And can you explain for us and our listeners why Candidacy Building is truly so essential?
Yeah, absolutely. Most families that think they don't need help throughout high school have a very misguided view of what actually matters in the admissions process. There's a lot of noise made about how complicated and nuanced the admissions process is, and it can be, but the reality is that 80 or 90% of the decision making falls along two variables, meaning if you satisfy these two variables, you're likely to do very well. One of them is, are you academically qualified? And people tend to have a sense of what that means and can go into more detail. And the other is, are you great at something in particular? Meaning, have you identified a passion or interest early on and developed that interest as far as possible? So as it relates to these parents, my response is all of the activities that you do, they're great and all, but they're actually not going to matter in the admissions process. Unless you're a recruited athlete, sports really aren't going to help you that much. If you're really into music, that's great. But unless you're like a child prodigy, that's not getting you into college, right? These schools are not conservatories. They don't focus on music. And so one of the things that I say about candidacy building generally is that it's not just about providing valuable opportunities. It's about providing valuable opportunities that are of the sort that will matter to admissions officers and which are directly relevant to a student's passions and interests. So talking about candidacy building in general, candidacy building, it's a term that sort of I came up with 10 years ago. But the basic idea was that it is easier to discern what an applicant needs to look like when they apply in order to get into school than it is to discern what they need to do today such that in several years they will be the kind of applicant who is successful in the admissions process. And so I think of candidacy building as reverse engineering success. You start with what would a very simple, somewhat overly concrete example of this would be. You look at a student, you say, okay, this student, in order to get into X and Y school that they want to get into, they're going to need to look like this on paper. They're going to have grades like this, test scores like this, they're going to have extracurriculars like this. That's an easier part. The hard part is then reverse engineering that over time so that students are building up cumulatively to those objectives over the course of high school. Another thing that I think some parents will probably understand, especially those who are in finance, is I think about counseling as similar to investing in that the advice that we offer a student today is more valuable than it will be in a year, which is to say that if all things being equal, it would be great if every family were starting in ninth grade, because that gives you 4 years to invest your time on the basis of that advice, which is considerably more valuable than if you start in 12th grade. So in any event, candidacy building from my perspective is much harder to do well than the application part, but it is actually the more important of the two. It is most definitely the difference maker in terms of students' outcomes.
Perfect. And now for our listeners who love examples and anecdotes, I'd love to go through an example student profile to really show candidacy building in practice. So prior to recording, I asked our listeners for some student profile submissions. So here it is. This student is going into 10th grade, is unclear about what major to apply as, but they have a vague idea that they might be interested in tech and maybe cybersecurity. This student has not done much outside of school, so no clubs, no extracurriculars, anything of the sort. So if this student were to go through our candidacy building program, what would that look like for them, especially if they are aiming for Ivy League schools?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, for most Ivy League schools, the sort of rule of thumb academically is that you really want to be in the top 10% of your grade academically. And that is a very rough number. It varies school to school. And that number changes depending on the competitiveness of your high school. So if you're at Phillips Exeter, it's probably closer to the top 20 or top 15%. Fundamentally, the top 10% tends to be a cutoff for a lot of these schools. So what does candidacy building look like? The way I think about our program is I created that framework a moment ago about there's academic qualifications on the one hand, and then there's your expertise in a given field on the other. Our candidacy building program kind of goes after both of these variables. On the academic side, candidacy building includes things like subject tutoring for students who are struggling in individual classes, class selection, summer programming selections, soft skill development like academic skills, time management, study skills, et cetera, and an advanced writing class. And so that's the kind of academic side of things, is a one-stop shop, everything you need to succeed academically. On the extracurricular side for this student, so the first thing that we would do is we would, even if they have a demonstrated interest in a particular area, we would still do some interest exploration to make sure that's really what they're interested in. I'll just assume for the sake of argument that cybersecurity is ultimately that is what it is. Which, by the way, a student who says I'm interested in tech, that is not nearly specific enough. My advice for students is if choosing an interest, try to choose something at the level of specificity of a college class, not at the level of specificity of a college major. So biology is a major. It's also super, super common. Marine biology is a class, usually not a major. But in any event, that's quite important in differentiating yourself from other students. So the first thing we do is we figure out what the student's interested in and then make sure that it's something that the student is able to differentiate themselves in. Then it would look like 3 or 4 tiered approach in working with the students. The first is education. So if this student is going to accomplish really uncommon things in cybersecurity, they actually need to know more about it than any other high school student, or mostly any other high school student. And so it can look like online programming, like online classes. It can just be a reading list. In some cases, it's a summer program, depending on how specialized the information is that they're looking to get. After that, it's about finding opportunities at their schools and in their immediate community. So for example, that might include starting a cybersecurity club at their high school. We help a lot of students create a lot of clubs. And it's a good way of showcasing your leadership in a familiar environment. After the immediate community, you take a step out and you're talking about opportunities in the community. So that might be community service related to cybersecurity. And an example of that might be that we help a student come up with a company that helps small businesses in their area with cybersecurity issues, because it's something that most small businesses know nothing about. And so that is a great way of showcasing your expertise in the field. It's also a great way of showcasing your leadership and contributing to your community at the same time. And then the final tier here in my mind is what we call signature projects. Sometimes I call them capstone experiences, but those basically fall into 4 categories. So one is really competitive competitions, and there's a very small population of those. Like ISEF is a good example of that. Now, from my perspective, competitions are a bad strategy. And they're a bad strategy because if you don't do very well, they really don't help you at all. But the amount of work that you have to put in order to do well, or to have a chance at doing well, is extremely high, meaning that it might take 60% of your time, and there might be a 95% chance that it is meaningless for you when it comes to college admissions. So focusing a strategy on competitions, in my mind, is a bad idea. The other 3, I think, are sounder strategies. So those include real internships, real meaning, A, it's not your parents' company or your parents' friend's company, and B, it's a company where you can actually contribute tangibly. So if you just like work a filing cabinet for a summer, no one's going to be impressed by that. For example, we had a student last year who worked at a small real estate firm for an internship and raised $150,000 for a project. That's very tangible, right? That's very significant. Now, if you were at a huge real estate company, you'd never have the opportunity to speak with investors. So these tend to be small companies. So that's internships, advanced research, working with professors, with postdoc researchers, doing your own original research, writing a research paper, submitting it for publication. That's hugely valuable. In fact, I have said a lot that I think of these kind of research opportunities as a necessity for students who are interested in the most competitive schools. I think it was last year, UPenn included a line about students who did research. I think it was like 20 or 30% of their student population that they had admitted had done advanced research in high school. If you compare that to the population of students who were applying that had done advanced research, that percentage is probably under 1%. So that is to say, under 1% of the applicant pool represented 20 or 30% of the actual admitted students. Now, take this with a grain of salt because I'm doing the numbers from memory. In any event, advanced research. Then the last one is something entrepreneurial. So starting something from scratch, whether that's a company or a nonprofit. So going back to the previous example, helping a student set up a cybersecurity firm that basically volunteers time to help small businesses in the area. That is a spectacular opportunity to demonstrate leadership and initiative related to your particular interests. So when you look at it on paper, expertise looks like I have done very advanced extracurriculars related to my interest.
Fantastic. I love that you brought up that stat about UPenn. Really shows the importance of showing a very advanced and developed interest in one particular area, which we absolutely help our students cultivate through our Leadership and Innovation Lab with signature projects, right? And academic mentorship programs with research papers. You briefly touched on this, but can we dive a bit deeper into the importance of both signature projects and research papers and how that fits into our InGenius Prep curriculum?
Sure. So when we started the company, we didn't have these resources. We weren't nearly big enough. We had admissions officers. And so what that meant is that our students were getting very high quality advice, like very objectively accurate advice on what they needed to do to get in. The problem is that students and parents did not have the resources or the wherewithal to execute on that strategy completely or in some cases at all. So for example, if you tell a student like, it would really be great if you did advanced research and published something, that isn't something that a student intuitively knows how to do, right? They can cold email 1,000 professors and they'll likely get 999 rejections and one maybe. So we built all of those resources. And the reason that we have these is precisely because what we found over time was that there was a small subset of extracurricular activities that seemed to have an outsized importance in admissions, those being internships, something entrepreneurial, and research opportunities. Starting with research, we have over 100 professors that currently work with us in our program in every kind of major discipline. Students will work with a professor for 6 weeks. And during that time, they're learning about the underlying subject matter. They're coming up with an original research topic. They're writing an outline for that research topic. And then they'll do 6 weeks working one-on-one with a teaching assistant, often a PhD candidate, who's actually helping them write a research paper. After which, if a student has completed the paper, we can help them submit for a publication through a variety of peer-reviewed journals that are designed for high school and college students that we partner with. Leadership and Innovation Lab, or LIL, is a startup incubator. The basic idea is that you're looking at between 9 to 12 weeks during which you're learning about all facets of leadership and entrepreneurship, everything from fundraising to legal organization, setting up bank accounts, management, hiring, employment contracts, the gamut. It really is a crash course. And then towards the end, you have an extensive business plan that you then launch, and then we mentor you through the process of actually building that organization. So we had a student, I want to say 2 years ago from Southern California, who set up a nonprofit to help the homeless in Malibu. And that nonprofit raised over $200,000. And that student ultimately ended up at Stanford. I suspect in no small part as a result of that accomplishment. We had a student a couple of years ago who was interested in public health and started a water filtration nonprofit where they would raise money from donors in the United States, buy commercial grade water filtration devices from, I think it's like Raytheon or one of the military manufacturers that sells it, and then send those products to disaster areas, like places that had seen earthquakes, tornadoes, mudslides, floods. Because one of the things the student understood is that in those disaster areas, the disaster itself often kills fewer people than starvation and a lack of access to clean water. So there's quite a lot of deaths that follow along that aren't actually directly related to the natural disaster. And so that student actually saved a couple of human lives, that being a very advanced, impressive experience. But that's what we're trying to foster through the Leadership and Innovation Lab.
I'm honestly so blown away by the projects. I feel like we really give students the tools, the connections, and the support to put their mind to something and really make a difference. And now, bringing everything to a full circle here, because something we say is that a student can be the best candidate or have the components to be the best candidate. But if they're not positioning themselves and presenting themselves in a way that is compelling to admissions officers, they might not have the best chance at acceptance, right? And that's what we do with our students students during application counseling. So can we walk our listeners through that program a bit further?
Sure. Candidacy building tends to be something that, as I've said, I think is absolutely essential and perhaps more essential than application counseling, but it isn't something that families are intuitively familiar with. And it's much harder to describe because it's so customized. Whereas the application process, every student is doing a personal statement. Every student is getting letters of recommendation. So it's more standardized. At our company, you work with two different types of counselors. So one type is a former admissions officer. So somebody who worked in the admissions office from a highly selective school. And the value of that person is strategic. They can offer you insights into how your tone, your topics, your focus will play in the admissions office when you apply. For example, a couple of years, Yale was making a bit of a push to recruit more women in STEM fields. And so an admissions officer can help you by saying, oh, okay, like you're going Yale early action. We should really play up this STEM experiences because that's something that they really care a great deal about. The other counselor is what we call a graduate coach. Graduate coach is somebody with experiences much like mine. As I said, I went to Dartmouth undergrad and then Yale Law School. A lot of our graduate coaches attended top law schools. A lot of them have PhDs in the humanities. The reason why we select these people is that they're expert writers. So it's the two perspectives that you absolutely need every time you work with a company. One is the perspective of an admissions officer, and the other is the perspective of somebody who is an expert, not just at writing themselves, but at helping others write. So they have a lot of writing related teaching experience. And so basically you start with them working on everything from school list until you're actually admitted. Why is application counseling important? It's important, I think, in large part because I've literally never met a student who was able to produce a good application on their own. The type of writing that applications ask for is not something that you have experience with. It's all introspective. It's about showing that you're impressive, but in a way that is not arrogant or obnoxious, which is very hard to do. It's quite a challenge to come up with the right tone. But the most talented students that we meet will often say, oh, no, I don't need help on the application. Here's my essay. I've prepared an essay already. And my answer to that is, listen, this is a very well-written essay, but it's a terrible personal statement. Like, it doesn't accomplish what you want it to and will be received poorly by an admissions office because students haven't read 10,000 other personal statements, but admissions officers have. And so they know what topics are like super overplayed and undervalued.
Perfect. And I love that you mentioned a student saying, I want you to look at just the essay and not anything else in the application. And I know that's something we hear quite often from both parents and students. But to that, we always say that it's really important that we actually look at all parts of an application because we relate all components to a student's application persona, which is something we focus heavily on at InGenius Prep. So can you explain to our listeners the idea behind an application persona, what that means, and how it relates within the application?
An application persona is your theme as an applicant, right? An example would be a future cybersecurity expert with a focus on social entrepreneurship. That's an application persona, right? And it's the purpose of an application persona is severalfold. One is to make sense of the activities that you've done. So oftentimes students will have a lot of disparate activities and you want to connect as many of them as possible. You'll never be able to connect all of them effectively. But one question that we ask students to discern an application persona is something like, what is the common motivation behind why you did X, Y, and Z? Seemingly disparate activities. And sometimes there's a common motivation and sometimes there isn't. So one of them is to make sense of what you've done. Another is a strategic direction, which is when we start thinking about application personas in ninth grade. And what we're thinking about is not, we don't call it an application persona at that point. What we call it is interest exploration. But what we're trying to figure out is, what are you passionate about? So maybe the student is really interested in cybersecurity, right? That is a viable application persona. So in ninth grade, okay, that's going to be the theme that we build on, and we build on it over the course of the next 4 years. Beyond that, application personas are important because they make you much more memorable and much more persuasive to an admissions officer. Memorable because an actual admissions officer in an admissions office will read between 1,000 and 1,500 applications per cycle. That could be as much as 20,000 pages of applications that they have to get through. If you read an application and you read 300 other applications, it's very hard to return to an application unless you can recall it simply, right? So if a student is trying to prove 10 different things about themselves on the application, it's very hard to be like, where's that application from the student who's a philanthropist, a scholar, an athlete, a student government leader? Like that's not going to happen. You don't remember that. On the other hand, it's very easy to remember, where's that student who's a cybersecurity expert? That's quite easy. So it makes you more memorable. It also makes you more persuasive. So an application persona is, at its most But by the way, application persona is a term that we made up. There's not like a part of the application where it's like, what is your persona? But it is a very important thing that all students should work on. The application persona is, above all else, an articulation of what makes you special or different from other students. And that is your argument for why you should be admitted. Ultimately, you don't get admitted because you're consistent with everyone else. You get admitted because you're differentiated from everybody else. And so you can think about having an application persona as the equivalent of coming in with one really strong, good argument on your behalf, why you should be admitted. Not having an application persona is like coming in with 10 very weak arguments. And for those listening who have done debate or any other forensics pursuit, that one very good argument is vastly better than 10 very bad arguments. So yes, that's what the application persona is and why it's so important.
Fantastic. And moving on to some listener questions here. Now, I've gotten quite a lot of these in my inbox, and they're all centered around DIY or do-it-yourself college applications. What are your thoughts on this, Joel? Even if these parents have been accepted and have graduated from Ivies and feel very strongly that they can help guide their child to do the same.
Sure. I'll start by saying two things about that. So one is, the reality of this industry is that you need very individualized attention, and you need individualized attention from people with oftentimes very impressive credentials. That's my way of saying that this is an industry that it's very hard to offer a valuable service that doesn't come with a significant price tag, which is true of all professional services tend to be this way. And I don't want people to come away with this thinking like, oh, it's a disaster if we DIY. There are some pitfalls that you want to avoid. It's not ideal, but they're certainly possible. The second thing that I would say, and this relates to the question of why I would advise against DIY generally, is I come from one such family. So in my family, both of my parents went to Cornell and Harvard Medical School. My sister, my brother-in-law both went to Cornell and Harvard Medical School. My brother went to Cornell and Dartmouth Business School. And actually, my grandparents had gone to Cornell as well. So it was a very kind of Cornell Ivy League family. The reality was that even though they had all gone to those schools, they had no idea. Firstly, my sister and brother did not have any idea why they got in. They just know that they did get in. My mom, she ran some portion of Cornell's alumni interview process. I think she did like the Northeast or something like that. And she did that for 20 or so years. Even she really did not understand what admissions offices were looking for. She was still very much biased by her understanding of what admissions officers were looking for when she was applying to college. And a big part of this is that it's extremely rare that I meet a family, no matter how educated the family is, no matter how much research they have done, that genuinely understands what admissions officers are looking for, because they don't actually know what admissions offices are looking at. They don't know what the other applicants look like. That's why having an admissions officer is so important. Another reason that I wouldn't advise DIY is it's very hard to know how to write a personal statement or any of these application essays, because you're never trained in high school or really anywhere to write like that. It is a very specific kind of writing that is specific to higher education in the United States, where you're called upon to demonstrate your maturity without seeming presumptuous. You're called upon to demonstrate your impressiveness without seeming arrogant. So it's very hard to strike that balance. The one piece of advice that I have for people who need to DIY is there are books out there that are basically like a compilation of personal statements that were admitted to this or that school. There's an important caveat there, which is that you don't see the rest of the application. So you don't actually know if the essay got them in or if the essay held them back more than they otherwise would, right? Whether their parents were huge donors to Harvard or whatever the case might be. But usually what you can discern, it's easy enough if you read through those in detail, you can start discerning which essays are meaningfully better than the rest. And you can assume that none of them is terrible. So those can be quite useful. And indeed, it's part of our curriculum. We have thousands of personal statements in our personal statement bank that are organized around subject area, where students got admitted, et cetera. So that can be an important tool in the DIY toolkit.
Perfect. And our next listener question here, they asked, for students who are not necessarily living in one of the major hubs in the country, is there anything different about these students and how they are approached in terms of admissions? I have also heard of people who have the means to do so claim an address in a smaller state, perhaps where they have a business as some sort of an advantage. So is there such a thing as an advantage to not living in one of these major hubs?
Absolutely. There's a small population of states and cities have the overwhelming population of elite high schools. So the tri-state area in the Northeast, California, Southern and Northern, Chicago, some places in Texas. But these schools care about all forms of diversity. One form of diversity is geographic diversity. meaning that they're not going to admit 50% of their class from 2 states. Right? In those states, you have more qualified applicants for proportionately fewer spots as opposed to other areas. I once joked with somebody, they said, like, can you guarantee I get into Harvard? And I was like, let me tell you how you guarantee that you get into Harvard. Okay, the first thing you do is you drop out of school, you move to South Dakota. North Dakota will also work. And I want you to get a 4.0 at that high school. I want you to get over a 1,500 on the SAT. I want you to do some basic extracurricular activities. Chances are you're getting into one of these schools because how many applicants are from these states? It's just incredibly few and far between. Now, I was obviously joking. I'm not actually advising anybody to do that. But absolutely, it comes at an advantage or a disadvantage if you're in one of those hubs. I do not recommend people changing their address for this purpose. That's not the meat and potatoes of how you get into school is geographic diversity.
Perfect. And for our last listener question here, they asked, what is one thing in a college application that you think students overlook but is very crucial to the process?
Letters of recommendation come to mind. I think that students assume that letters of recommendation are a foregone conclusion. You ask and then you walk away and you hope it's good. And they don't understand that you actually have a great deal of control over what is said and how it's said, but only if you exercise it. So a couple of very important pieces of advice for letters of recommendation. The first is you must ask early. Ask much earlier than other students. Why? Because 20% of teachers get 80% of the letter of recommendation requests. And that being the case, those teachers who are almost certainly underpaid as it is, are not being compensated for the mountain of letters of recommendation that they're being asked to write. So when they come down to it, most teachers, and this is just from my own anecdotal observations, they use templates and they make some small changes and they send those off. What's the problem with that? The admissions officer at whatever college you're applying to, they're going to see all of the students applying from your high school and they're going to know whether or not a teacher used a template. Now, if you ask early and you ask correctly, which I'll explain what that means in a second, you're much more likely to get a personalized original letter. And that just looks much better in the admissions office. It's also just more helpful. Now, asking correctly, this gets a little awkward. The goal is to be helpful to the teachers, but also to tell them how they can be helpful to you. And so what that normally means is you come prepared with a resume, maybe a writing sample or a work sample from the teacher's class, and then usually a list of topics that you want the person to consider writing about, right? This might look like an outline. It might be more unstructured than an outline. A lot of teachers really appreciate this. It makes their job much, much easier to write these things. And so what I advise students to do is to talk with their teachers directly about it, to go through their list and to ask them, do you feel comfortable saying these things? And if the answer to these questions is no, chances are this is not a good person to ask for a letter of recommendation. So it's best to know. And so that is how you take control of the letters of recommendation, which is extremely important. You have to remember that applications are all your word to an admissions office, and everybody exaggerates about themselves. The letters of recommendation are the only third-party testimony as to who you are and what you're like. And so if those are stellar, it goes a long way to getting you in.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Joel, and for sharing your expertise with our listeners. To wrap up this interview, I'd like to ask you the one question I ask all my podcast guests, and that is, if you could give one key piece of advice to parents and students, and this can be about anything college admissions, what would that be?
The biggest piece of advice I could offer families is help students figure out early on what they really like doing, and then help them develop a compelling extracurricular profile around those things. The academics, they're extremely important, but the reality is they are probably easier to satisfy than the sort of extracurricular obligations that are necessary these days to get admitted. So I would put a very heavy emphasis on those.
Once again, to our listeners, I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this journey inside the admissions office. I've enjoyed getting to interact with you all via email and have really appreciated all the support. But do not worry, the podcast is not going anywhere and I'm not leaving InGenius Prep. I'll be supporting from the sidelines, and I'm handing the mic over to your next wonderful host, Jillian, who will be taking over from here and bringing you exciting new episodes. We have a lot planned for you all, and of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts, so do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. This is me, Noelle, officially signing off as your podcast host. It's been an honor, and goodbye for now. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you would like to speak with one of our experts, you can set up a complimentary strategy call with one of our enrollment counselors by following the link in our episode description. And for more information and access to additional resources, you can register for our webinars, which is also linked in the episode description. If you have any questions or would like to request a topic for a future episode, you can email me directly at noel.kim@ingeniusprep.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Inside the Admissions Office, and don't forget to follow the podcast so you're notified every time a new episode is available. That's all for now, and I hope you'll join me next time as we continue our journey inside the admissions office.